Folks, here we are back at it. So excited to be jumping in with the brilliant Rashid Khalidi here on AirGo.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Caw-caw.
Brr, 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 brr.
Hey.
Wow.
uh, and most just so you know, most people do get some of those animal voice sound effects. Most people don't get all of them, and I think you got the full canon there. So congratulations.
Good. It's good.
So I think we'll start in the same place we start all of our conversations. It's a bit of a ritual, and it's a two-part question centered around time, and it can mean however you define it: this hour, this day, this season, this lifetime. Rashid, how is the world treating you, and how are you treating the world?
I mean, the world is treating me personally okay. I don't think the world is in very good shape. And that obviously brings me down. And it's a source of distress. And I don't see a hell of a lot of light on the horizon as far as the things that interest me and concern me the most, which is what's happening in the Middle East, in Palestine and Lebanon. So, the world is treating me personally okay. I can't complain, but the world is bringing me down. We're not in a good place.
What about on the inverse? How are you trying to treat the world?
You push your little pebble up the hill and you do what you can. I got a despairing email from somebody who told me I'm doing this and this and this. What can I do to stop this genocide? I said to her, keep pushing. I mean, it sounds like you're doing everything you should possibly do. So I do everything I can possibly do. I teach, I write, I do, interviews like this, do lectures. I have 5 lectures this week besides my teaching here at Columbia. So I do what I can do. I wish I could do more. The powers that be are impervious to pressure from below until it becomes overwhelming. It's the same powers, the same people own our politicians and own our universities and own our media, and they are impervious to anything but really intense pressure. And we're not quite. So it's still frustrating, but we are actually moving the needle. I'm positive of that.
I want to invite you to go a little bit deeper about your relationship to your work. And so, you named pushing up your pebble, and that you have these different interrelated methods of pushing your pebble: teaching, lecturing, writing, appearing in spaces like this. Which one feels the most comfortable or natural or satisfying for you?
The one that's most satisfying is writing. And for me, anyway, to write, like on the project I've been trying to work on for a couple of years, you have to have a certain peace of mind. And I just don't have that right now. So this project on Ireland and Britain, Ireland, and Palestine is sort of stalled. So that's the thing that gives me the most pleasure. And then seeing the results of my writing and being able to talk to people about my writing. I have a book that came out 4 years ago, and I have not stopped talking about it for the whole of those 4 years. That's less satisfying than writing the damn book, I got to tell you. But it's good. It's good. I'm not complaining at all. I'm better than I'm talking about my book than nobody's talking about my book.
Yeah,
I know people are still asking. But the thing that gives me by far the most satisfaction is writing. I like speaking. I mean, I've been teaching for 50 years. I've been doing it professionally.
Congratulations. We'll talk a little bit about the time we're in right now.
Yeah.
But the big fit 5-0.
And so I actually enjoy doing it. It gives me energy rather than draining. I mean, when I do 2 in a day, or yesterday I did 3 in a day, an interview and two lectures, Cairo and Penn State. I mean, it's not as far apart as you can get. And it was pleasurable talking to, interesting people in a different place about things that they were interested in and that I was interested in too. So I like that too.
A question that's been coming up a lot for me with people we've been in conversation with, especially people who've written books, is the relationship of learning from your text after it's engaging the world. So, basically what a book is here's a presentation of all the things I learned, or I think I know, or the questions that I'm asking. I've codified it, put it together, and here I'm going to give it to you. And then someone like you writes a book that is needed, that's resonated, that people are talking about in different spaces. And then you spend 4 years talking about it. And I'm curious of like in that after process, does that teach you anything new about the work and having to talk about it with different people or see how folks receive it?
That's
and
a
for
good,
you, what has that been?
that's a really good question. Yes. I mean, I haven't written anything in my life. I've written like 120 articles. I've written 8 books, whatever. I haven't written anything in my life that I don't look at now and say, oh man, you should have done this and you should have said that. And that's true of this book too. I mean, having gone over it, God knows how many times now, there are so many things there are so many things I would do differently. So yes, you get, unless you're, dead from the neck up, you should get from that kind of intensive feedback, you should get something. And I have on this book. I give you a perfect example. You talk about the Zionist project in Israel as both settler colonial and national. It's a national project, it's a settler colonial project. Like the United States, but different in other ways. I could talk about it. That's not important. But one of the things I realized
it's very, very important, but to this
I know,
particular
it's very
point,
important, but
I
I
know
want
what
to
you mean.
finish a narrow point. One of the things I realized talking to people about this book is I should have laid stress on Israel as it's seen as a refuge for people who are persecuted by Christian anti-Semitism. And I should have talked more about the biblical link. And those are important. I should have talked more about Christian Zionism. I mean, those are things that should have been in this book to fully explain some of the things I'm saying about Israel as a settler project. And I really realized that talking to people in the 4 years since the book has been published. So that's just one example.
So I want to talk a little bit about that, the way that and the time in which this book has been useful for so many people in the midst of the horror and genocidal violence that we're witnessing, encountering, feeling in different ways in our bodies. And so there's a contradiction. We will ring our contradiction bell, which we add in post, of, the unprecedented, at least to me, what I define as unprecedented surge in engagement, wrestling, solidarity alongside that, and in some ways perversely created by the structure and intensity of the violence that has happened. And so that can be a political reality, but as a person engaging both of those, I'm very curious, how do you hold that contradiction of like, how many more people are reaching for your book? How many more questions that you've been waiting for people to ask are being asked? And the reality that comes from something intolerable to hold and know to be true.
I mean, if I weren't doing this, I would be tearing my hair out. So it's bad enough that I'm trying to push that pebble up the hill. And that, to some extent, distracts me and makes me feel like I'm justifying my existence.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very, very hard to feel that, what we are seeing in this country is actually, you're completely right, utterly unprecedented. There has never been a time in American history since Woodrow Wilson that Zionism and later Israel have not been heavily favored by large majorities of Americans. That's no longer the case. Majorities of Americans are critical of Israel's war, critical of Biden's policy, and don't want arms sent to Israel. This has never happened in U.S. history in 110 years, since 1917, whatever the number of years, 107. So, I mean, you see that on the one hand, and then you see the levers of power continuing to be pulled by people who couldn't give a damn about what people think, what majorities of the Democratic Party base, for example.
About anything.
Well, they don't care about it. As we know, they do exactly as they please in any case, unless they're forced to do otherwise. And this isn't just yet another example. I mean, they make war without our consent. They do they spend a fortune on weapons that'll never be used, and the goddamn trains don't. But that's another issue. So you're right. They do that all the time and everywhere. So it's heart-rending to realize that whatever anybody does, it hasn't stopped. In fact, it's actually getting worse. Think that what they did before in Gaza was bad. Watch what they're doing in the northern part of Gaza today. They are trying to purposely and intentionally, with declared intent, starve people to death until they leave so they can turn the whole northern part of Gaza, which includes where the overwhelming majority of the population used to live, into a free fire zone, and argued that anyone there who hasn't left because we starved them to death and bombed them and shunned them is the enemy, and we can kill them with impunity. Now, they do that anyway. They kill with impunity anyway, but here they're giving themselves a super shield against international humanitarian law, against any form of morality. And they are doing, so they've intensified. And they're doing things in Lebanon they didn't do before. Before, they'd occupy a village. Now they are emptying villages. So you have 1.25 million Lebanese who've been made homeless over the course of just a couple of weeks. So a couple million people in Gaza and 1.25 million in Lebanon. These are unprecedented numbers. You had a larger proportion of the Palestinian population made homeless in 1948 during the Nakba. But so the proportions are small, but the numbers, this is worse than the 82 war. This is worse than anything they've ever done to Gaza. And when you see that, and when you have people there, I have people in Beirut, I have people in Lebanon, I have people in the West Bank. We had people in Gaza. Thank God the family in Gaza were able to leave when the Rafah crossing was still open, before the Israelis closed it. So in intimate detail, not just what you see on social media, what you see on your phone or on TV, from my cousin who is working in civil defense, and the Israelis are bombing ambulances, and they're telling the people, we know where you are, don't move, or we'll attack you. And they then attack. There's 80 or 100 healthcare workers have been killed in Lebanon in 2 weeks. Emergency responders, not healthcare. So I worry about her, and she won't stop doing what she's doing. She's, so that makes it all the harder that everything that we all are doing has not yet so far moved the needle as far as the American participation in this war. It's not support for this war. The United States is fighting this war. There are Americans helping to target Hamas leaders. There are Americans helping to target Hezbollah leaders. There are American officers and American intelligence personnel on the ground together with Israelis. This is published in the New York Times. This is not my fabrication. They are not just providing the weapons. They're actually, there are boots on the ground, even before the 100 guys with the anti-missile missiles arrived this morning. And so we are doing this. And that we haven't changed the needle, but been able to move the needle here yet, is a source of immense frustration. But at the same time, you can see that public opinion is continuing to shift in our direction. And, I've been through this before. I was involved in trying, when I was a much younger person, during the Vietnam War, in support, against the war, and in support at the time when I was an undergraduate, in support of the Panthers up in New Haven. And, took from 1963 to 1975 to stop that goddamn war. And nothing stopped what they did to the Panthers. It took years and years and years after the Iraq War started for the people to stop the war. It wasn't the generals, and it wasn't the people in the White House, and it wasn't the people who sell the weapons and make profit off of that who stopped the Iraq. It was a complete absence of public support for the war. And that was a result of people demonstrating. And it took a very long time. And that's true of every kind of change. Whether you're talking about slavery, or whether you're talking about civil rights, whether you're talking about apartheid, whether you're talking about LGBTQ rights, whatever, it takes a very long time. So you shouldn't be discouraged, but I am still frustrated.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's one thing to hold that as a historical fact, and it's another thing to feel the complete lack of ability. Just the time scales are so different. Because you say, okay, that's 3 years, and then you remember how many days there are in 3 years, and you remember how many people are alive each of those days, and how many people's lives are being upended, ruined, stolen. I'm curious for you. There's the people in those places, and then there's the training of your discipline. How are you wrestling with the contradictions of these time scales in this?
It's it's so easy for me to, in effect, take refuge and take solace from the fact that nothing comes easy. And I've seen it so many times in so many ways, and so many failures, and so many, abortive attempts over all of these years that I've been doing this stuff. That does to some extent comfort. I mean, I have to say, Mao talked about long-term people's war. And the key element here is long-term. He marches off into the depths of China to prepare to deal with the Kuomintang and to deal with the Japanese. He realizes this is going to take a hell of a long time. It's not going to happen in 1936 or 7 or 8. And it didn't. It didn't happen until 1949. Well, 45, the Japanese, and 49, the Kuomintang. So, I mean, I'm not saying, we all have to wait as long as the Chinese. It can snap tomorrow if we push hard enough, maybe. But the pain of waking up and looking at the news every morning is assuaged by the fact that we're going to end this one way or another sooner.
So from that space of this will and must end, we have seen over this last year and over these last 5 years, what I've heard from different scholars, different elders, different movement participants, that this is a level of investment, participation, solidarity in Palestinian liberation that we have not seen.
True.
But is there a pain that required such an intense expansion of genocide?
Say that again, Damon.
Is there a pain in the fact that investment took this expansion and genocide to get folks to step up? So the both and, that's what I want you to walk us through, of like, one, as a historian and as an organizer and participant, contextualize and tell us how it feels to see this uptick. And there's so much beauty and there's so much commitment that we want to amplify, but also hold that it is at the result of so much blood that folks got activated in this way.
I mean,
what does it teach us?
I'd take 50,000 people being slaughtered in Gaza, and maybe so far a couple thousand in Lebanon, for people to realize what was always true, which is that occupation and colonization and ethnic cleansing produce resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And force cannot resolve that contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
Force can never resolve. I mean, that should have been obvious in the 40s or the 50s or the 60s or the 70s or the 80s at any stage, or the 90s or in the last 2 decades. But it wasn't. You did not have a Palestine solidarity movement that had any impact on anything in the United States ever before. You had people who were trying. They scored successes in some respects.
People were building the movement.
Things changed inside the movement through intersectionality, through people involved in Palestine understanding that what happened at Standing Rock or what happened in Ferguson actually was them and concerned them. I mean, people grew over the last decade or two, and the movement grew, and the sophistication of how people thought grew. But until the last decade or so, I don't think you could argue that that movement had successes. I came to Columbia just after a referendum for the university to divest from companies that support Israeli occupation. Failed at Columbia. I think it was a year before I came, so like 22 years ago, whatever. I don't know. I wasn't here. I was in Chicago. Similar referendum passed by overwhelming margin in 2020. That's, I mean, there you go. Somebody was doing something. It's not like nobody
in the lifetime of an undergraduate student, basically.
Exactly. Well, so the people who are now either investment bankers or movement lawyers, and were undergraduates in 2000, voted as they voted, are watching their children vote quite different.
Yeah.
And that we just had another vote in engineering school to the same effect. I mean, there's been a huge change, and that is to me enormously. We don't have anything like the level that we had last year, this year. The agents of repression, the agents of the support of the status quo, the powers that be, the moneyed people who own everything, they have put together over the summer a program that has been extraordinarily successful. And, you guys are not students, but you guys remember what it was like to be a student. When you're a student, the world starts in September, ends in May, and that's it. That's the life of a student. That's an academic year. And the rest is not, they go away and nothing happens, and then they come back in October. And the other boys have barriers and checkpoints and rules and expulsions and convictions and all to come down on you if you move. So it may seem discouraging on some campuses, but the zeal and the feelings and the anger are all still. You can argue that the students should have done this differently or done that different. That's not the point. That's not the point. The point is that the tide is still running in that direction, and it's not stoppable. In my view, it could be changed. I mean, they could put more efforts into repression than they have. I mean, we may have a different presidency in January, and they might put more and different efforts into repression. This lot is doing a pretty good job, by the way. And what the Justice Department, what the FBI are doing today, what the NYPD is doing today, is pretty damn bad. In coordination, by the way, the NYPD has an office in Tel Aviv to coordinate with the Israeli intelligence services. And the same woman who runs the New York Police Department's anti-terrorism unit is in charge of liaison with the Israeli intelligence services. So it's all one big family when it gets to the thugs.
And that's such a tangible example of what, campaigns like the Deadly Exchange have documented, is that even for the police departments that maybe don't have a brick and mortar, for lack of a better term, the interchange, the people going back and forth, cops being trained by the IDF and vice versa, is something that has been, years and years of base building on their end, and real knowledge exchange also. But, you mentioned...
I just want to say something about that. A lot of these police forces are not actually trained by the Israeli police or even by the Israeli domestic security forces, the Shabak, the Shin Bet, who are involved. Some of them are trained by the border guards. What are the border guards? The border guards, Mashmar Hanvul is called in Hebrew. The border guards are the guys who are charged with colonial policing. So what they are importing into New York and Chicago and other police departments that partake of this training is how to keep subjugated colonial populations under control. It's not urban policing. It's not whatever euphemism they use for the kind of repression that's doled out by regular police departments. This is paramilitary colonial counterinsurgency that is being imparted to mainly American urban police departments. And that shows what they think of people in cities like New York and Chicago, out in the neighborhoods. And that you are a colonized population to be kept subjugated. And we are being taught by the best in the world in how to subjugate a colonized population.
Yeah, I'm going to let that sit. Yeah. So to that point, I want to... No. I was like, I could say my pithy response, but I was like, that's pithy enough, and it's better if it's pithy from you. So I want to go back for 1 second. You mentioned, of course, the changes that you see on campus since, over the course of the summer, and, in our little ways, though we're not students and we're engaging with students on campuses, we're seeing on so many of them these time, place, manner policies, or, in order to have a public event, you have to have it approved by the police force. All these, let me figure out how to phrase this. We're seeing the regimentalization of that border protection, right? It wasn't that wasn't what the campus security and the cops were doing before, but all of a sudden now this is structuralized. To even participate in something like that, you need that approval, in ways that, is not that different from if you're planning a mass action. You have to get your permit. And I think that's a reality.
Or they want you to think.
Yeah. And so I bring that up as an entry point to talk about what I hear, see, am just feeling from whether it's students, young people, or just other people who were mobilized over the past year. You said you've been doing this for a long time. You've seen the flows of this, the human pace, the pullback, the blowback, the front lashes, Miriam Kaba calls it, of the state re-entrenching. And so I'm wondering, not what's the hopeful message to the young people. It's not that, but it's like, what have you learned for someone who's feeling not just that despair, but also has never felt that before, of what happens when that retrenchment happens? What do they need to know about how to move through that without losing the ability to continue?
Yeah.
Or what perspective could
I mean,
history
I can't
offer? It
preach
may not
about
be a
the
blue
tone
book.
to. That's not going to work. You know, I can't say long-term I can't say that's not the way to assuage that concern. And a lot of them are disappointed and even despondent right now because everything that was done last year. I mean, what was done last year, I got to say, is a world historic. You know, they talk about 1968 at Columbia or in Paris. This was world historic. They started something that affected the entire world, the student population of the entire world, and populations far beyond students, from Indonesia and Bangladesh to Cairo to Paris to London. I mean, this was a world historic achievement, not just event, achievement on the part of just a few students. It's really quite, I mean, people will look back on this and say, this changed history. I mean, I'm hoping and praying it will change history. I think it will. I can't be sure. But I think they may look back on it and say, God damn, a bunch of crazy students started this. So that's one thing I try. I mean, I was talking to a bunch of Palestinian students here, and they who are a little bit down. And that's one of the things that I said to them. You know, you should take pride in the fact that you all have achieved what you've already achieved, even if it hasn't stopped the war, even if you still have relatives dying, even if we still are watching these horrible scenes, and they're actually getting more horrible. I mean, people burning to death with IVs attached. We actually haven't seen that, but now we've seen it. So it's harder and harder and harder. Second thing I say to them is, or I would say to them, is that, you know, it's really hard when you see things with an immediacy that nobody really did in the past. We didn't really see Vietnam. We didn't really see the veil of the state of mainstream corporate media, which just operates as a megaphone for the state. Until very late in the war, each of these wars protected us, prevented us from seeing with our own eyes the absolute horrors of Southeast Asia and the absolute horrors of Iraq and Afghanistan.
I would argue we saw less of Iraq than we saw of Vietnam.
Pardon me?
I would argue we saw less of Iraq than we saw of Vietnam.
I mean, they learned from Vietnam. They learned how to embed and they learned how to control in ways that they hadn't. There's a wonderful book on it. You're absolutely right. Nevertheless, there's no filter to it. I do not know a student who pays any attention to the New York Times. I don't know one. I have a class of 250, and I used to, today 250 was larger in the past. It's a basic entry-level modern Middle East history. And I used to be able to make a reference to something that appeared in the New York Times, and a quarter of the class would sort of nod their head. They'd seen it. Nobody reads the New York Times. Nobody reads CNN. Nobody. Not one person. Even older students don't look at that. They have complete contempt for the mainstream media. Nobody had a choice in the 1960s or 70s. Nobody had much of a choice even in the early 2000s when the Iraq War started. They had some options. Today, they get their news from an enormous variety of sources. And they see these horrors. And so it's even harder for them to exercise any kind of patience and to say, we haven't stopped it. What can we do? I mean, they're driven by a moral outrage, which I have to say, I think is greater than our moral outrage. And we were subject to the draft, for God's sakes. So it's moral outrage. I mean, our skins.
Self-preservation.
You know, they were going to draft our asses. And they did draft almost everybody. If you didn't leave the country, you got drafted. And in spite of that, I think that the level of moral outrage and the level of passion today is in some ways even higher among young people, even though their lives are not on the line, or not potentially on the line. The last thing I say to them is, you know, I was an undergraduate at Yale, a lucky guy. I was at Yale. And we were, you know, completely engaged. The entire campus was with us. in terms of both, trying to support the Panthers. The cops were liquidating Panther leaderships city by city. You know what happened in Chicago. It was happening everywhere in Oakland, everywhere, all over the country. And there was the same fear about the Panther leadership. And there was a trial of a number of Black Panthers in the courthouse on the Green in New Haven. And we had a huge anti-war movement. And what I tell students today is that we had all kinds of really wise movement people coming to us. Dave Dellinger, other people who are among the members of the Chicago Seven. William Sloan Coffin, one of the chaplain at Yale. He's one of the great leaders of the anti-war and marched with King and of the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, extremely wise, deeply committed, experienced leaders of anti-war and civil rights movement. We didn't listen to them. They you guys should say, do whatever you all want to do. I mean, you want to ask for my advice, I'll give you my advice, but I'm not suggesting you necessarily should take it. And, make your own mistakes, and you will. I mean, we did.
Right.
God help us. We did a number of dumb things. But that's what I would tell them, those things, that it's going to take a while. The fact that it's on your screens and tearing your, minds apart shouldn't lead you to be impatient, shouldn't lead you to understand that these things, it's a process. It'll take time.
That's such a beautiful story. And I kind of want to use the container of that story.
Can I stop? Because my wife is trying to call me. I got to tell her I'm in an interview. I told her
Sure.
I give this woman a schedule.
No, we understand. We understand.
Your
And
speaking arrangements.
She comes up and she got to talk to me.
That's all right. No problem.
And I said to her, didn't you know I was doing X? She said, yeah, I know. I have the piece of paper here. Or whatever.
But you also had the answer to the question, or at least the piece of information that was needed.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, guys.
Okay. So that's a beautiful story. And I want to use the container of that story and how you showed up in it to take a moment to humanize you. And I guess to also parallel to what we're doing right now in this time, to what you have done hundreds of times through the decades, and I'm sure dozens of times over the last 12 months. And I want to be accountable in it because we were very excited to talk to you because there's a grace and a sage wisdom with which you speak about this unspeakable catastrophe and tragic violence. Some of it seems to be because you're a historian and that's how you're rooted. Some of it seems to just be like your East Coast New York swagger, a little bit of like, you just speak things truthfully. And some of it may be...
As a New Yorker, it was something that I noticed immediately. I was like, oh, this guy, it sounds like he's telling you to stay, that the back door on the bus needs to be open. Like, back door, know the truth. Let's go. Come on. Keep it moving,
Yeah, let him out.
Exactly.
These doofuses trying to push their way into a subway car before the people.
Come on, what are you doing? Stay clear of the closing goddamn doors. Let's go. Let's move through. Come on.
And some of it may also be assumptions, appropriate or maybe inappropriate, of the intersection of age and gender. Because we were really excited or comforted to have this conversation because there is a sensitivity and an awareness of woundedness and trauma when trying to talk about what's happening to the Palestinian people right now, especially when talking to Palestinian people, that we have been trying to figure out how to maneuver this last year. But you show up as the mentor, as the educator, as the air quote expert. And I was not as afraid of maneuvering your wounds or your triggers. And 5 minutes in the conversation, I kind of internally check myself. I'm like, that's not an appropriate assumption. And so I just want to give you space I see how steady-handed you have been in helping guide the world, literally, through comprehending and mobilizing and staying present and active during this time. But I can't imagine the actual weight that you're feeling and the pain and the loss and the horror that you're experiencing on a day-to-day. Do people know how to hold you in these spaces, or have you become practiced, or has the experiences kind of changed the way this shows up for you?
Yeah,
as much or as little as you want to share to this.
That's a hard question, Damon. I mean, I'm very fortunate to have a support group of my family. I have a very large family. I got about 100 cousins. I'm talking like first cousins and their children and their grandchildren. And I got nephews and nieces and grandchildren and children, you know, the lot. They help. You know, some of them are in like Beirut or Ramallah. I mean, they're anguished. Some of them have family that just escaped from Gaza. So, you know, that it's not like they're, you know, in a place of comfort and able to comfort me. But having that to fall back on, I mean, I have a wife who is as tough as nails and has been through it all with me. I mean, you know, she has the same experience as I have. She carried a baby through bombardments. You know, she was pregnant with a child and ran from where the Israelis were bombing to get home to her daughters. There's not a lot that phases her. I didn't have to carry a baby through the 82. We had two older children, but she was pregnant. So I have that, you know, that's the first thing. I have that support system, which is really important. And I'm very fortunate here in New York to be surrounded by people, colleagues and friends, some of them Palestinians, some of them Arabs, some of them, you know, foreigners, some of them Americans, of every, you know, race, gender, color, type, age, whatever, young ones, old ones, who are friends and allies and comrades. And so we're very fortunate to have that kind of support now. That makes it easier, but it doesn't, you know, change the reality. There's one other thing that makes it a little easier, which is the complete irreverence of some of my nephews and nieces and younger cousins, one of my kids, for me and everything I do. for the older members of the family, folks who are like,
I thought you were about to say like the status quo or like respectability.
Yeah, we are.
No, the reference for me.
They have formed a revolutionary tribunal, headed by the honorable judge, your old grandson, the prosecutor general, my 7-year-old granddaughter. Those are the puppets for my cousins and nephews and nieces who are keeping us real.
They're propping it up.
We're deviating here by talking to the New York Times. Why are you telling us this? This is just propaganda or whatever they say. And that, you know, that helps. I mean, when you're facing unimaginable harm, if you can't, you know, just briefly avert your eyes, you can go crazy. Look at Greek tragedy. You look at it too much and it drives you crazy. So I'm fortunate to have both the support network and the people who are constantly keeping it active. And then I do something that a lot of people don't do is I literally turn off. You know, I will just not pay attention to the news for 3 hours. And some people can't do that. They doom scroll. They can. Muna, my wife, has trouble turning it off. She starts watching a Jazeera or she starts watching a series of podcasts or whatever it may be. And she just goes down that. And I have to, you know, yeah, just to be pulled out. I can do that. I mean, fortunately, you know, I go off and I play tennis or I watch a baseball game. And for that period of time, at least in between innings, I go back to the, but at least, you know, well, there's a batter, pitcher going at it. I don't have to think about the harms. And I don't know how you operate if you can't do that. I mean, I have a fairly thick skin. And I guess it helps that we've been through some of this. I mean, we lived in Beirut together from 1972 to 1983. And those 11, 12 years, there was war for 10 of them. On and off war, but war. You know, starting in 1973, Lebanese army attacking the refugee camps, through the 75, 76 war, through Israeli invasion of 78, Civil War, Syrian invasion of the areas that the PLO was in, and so on and so forth. And then the Israeli invasion of 82. So we've been there. We've done. I mean, there's nothing that we're seeing that we haven't, in a much, fortunately for us, diminished form, actually experienced. I mean, we had to leave our home twice during the war. once we had to flee to my mom's house, and then when my mom's house was exposed, we had to flee back to our house. So it's not like we don't know what people are going through. We were much more fortunate, not comparing, but you know what you're talking about when you had to do it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to calm the children when they're scared of, airplanes bombing, when the Israelis were bombing Beirut in 82. So I on the one hand, it makes you understand better, but on the other hand, it immunizes you. It gives you deep sympathy for people who can't get water or gas or fuel or vegetables. And there's no running water, and there's, no toilets. I mean, we've been through that. Not in anywhere near the kind of situation of atrocity that Gaza or some parts of Lebanon are going through. But and that means you sympathize, but you also understand, but you also are you can take it in a sense. I have relatives in Beirut who've been there ever since the first beginning of these wars, and as far as Lebanon is concerned. They're tough as nails. They're resilient. It's really hard, but they have that resilience. And I see people who haven't, who are not from Gaza and haven't been through what Gaza has been going through, or who have not lived in Lebanon or not lived in other parts of Palestine. It's much harder. Unimaginable horror. For me, it's imaginable horror. I don't know if that makes a difference.
And is there? I imagine there's sympathy for that, but I can also imagine there being some like frustration or irritance or annoyance. It's kind of like a, Western privilege thing. Like,
yeah.
And so,
but the diaspora
that's
is
part of
so
the
much
process.
worse than Palestinians who live in Palestine. I mean, it's not exactly white privilege, but you call it diaspora privilege. They've not been through it.
Yeah. And so to that,
they're more freaked out, and on the other hand, they don't fully understand or comprehend.
To that point, you talk so much about the ways that, to that point, one of the things in preparing to talk to you today and listening to your conversation with Bill from a few years ago on his podcast that jumped out to me was the ways that like myth and ahistoricism are a necessity for colonial structure and colonial violence. And I wonder, whether that's from people who have not physically had that experience where it is unimaginable, or just other people you're seeing beginning to engage. Are there myths? Are there ahistoricisms from those who are trying to understand a thing that is not understandable unless you've lived it, that you're watching play out? It's kind of a nuanced, tricky question, but like, what are the things that you see people believing, seeing, reinforcing that from someone who has both studied and lived it is like, well, that's not quite it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want what I'm about to say to sound critical.
Okay.
But you put the question to me, so I'm gonna. I have the term settler colonialism in the subtitle of my book, and I have argued in the book that settler colonialism is central to any understanding of what's going on in Palestine. That said, a lot of people have a very simplistic understanding. I'm not saying myth. I wouldn't go anywhere near as far as saying myth. But let's just say a simplified understanding, which is devoid of nuance and can lead them to some very dangerous, or at least mistaken, conclusions. So Israel is a settler colonial project. Zionist project, which becomes the state of Israel, is a settler colonial. It also is multiple other things. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand anything. You don't understand how it develops with the rise of Hitler and how the Holocaust affects it. If you don't understand the history of the persecution of Jews in Europe and the theological basis of that. The Jewish people are the killers of Christ in Catholic doctrine until the 1960s. There's a theological basis for anti-Semitism. It's not just some people hate Jews. Their church was telling them to hate Jews for 2,000 years or 1,800 years. So you're talking about a depth of anti-Semitism rooted in Christian belief, which is, if you don't know that, unimaginable. Why does the King of England kick every single Jew out of England in the 13th century? Why does the French king kick every Jew out of his domains in the 14th century, and the King of Spain and Portugal at the end of the 15th century? There's a root to this. And this is something that is deep in the history of European Christianity. Okay? It's a theological basis for anti-Semitism. And that has affected people over millennia. We're not talking a generation or two or 10. We're talking millennia. And if you don't understand that as the background, one of the elements in the background to Zionism, you don't understand anything. It's not like colonial. No, it's not like Canada. It's not like South Africa. It's not like Algeria. Each of these is completely distinct and unique. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand anything, that you misunderstand. So that's the first. The second thing is this idea of the settler. Oh, so many settlers were killed. Well, there were 6 babies and 3 old people and 2 pregnant women. And then you'll say, yes, it's a settler colonial project, but that doesn't mean that they're not also civilians. And if you have any kind of sense of international humanitarian law, that they're non-combatants and they should not be killed or harmed in any way. And you have a failure to grasp that somewhere along the line, a settler colonial project produces an entity in which the population should not be treated as if every baby and every old person and every pregnant woman is a legitimate target of the violence of the oppressed indigenous population. Now, I can give you multiple examples of anti-colonial struggles in which every person among the colonists was a target of the violence of the indigenous population in Algeria, in South Africa, in again and again, in slave uprisings.
Right.
It's not like that doesn't happen. And it's not like that's not explicable. It's explicable. But it's not a good thing, but it's a thing. It is. It is what it is. But in the 21st century, if you have any sense of what international humanitarian law and the rules of war, the rules of war are, then you have to make those differentiations. You don't have to accept international humanitarian law. You can say, we're going to go back to the law of the jungle and whoever's strongest wins. Or you can argue correctly, international humanitarian law is created by colonists, colonial powers, imperial powers, and is only used to protect white Europeans. It doesn't.
And they're refusing to follow it in real time, so why should we?
Exactly. You can make both of those arguments, but you have to make those and then say, therefore, all of them are settlers. And if you apply that to Israel, you got to apply it to the United States or Canada or Australia or New Zealand. Now, those are places where the indigenous population was either destroyed or subjugated. Okay? So they're still there, but they were subjugated in the United States, for example, Native Americans. They're still fighting, and they're making actually gains now. But the point is, you have to look at yourself as a settler in that case. And you have to consider yourself and your grandchildren and your aged mother and your disabled uncle as legitimate targets of indigenous violence. I mean, it's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. You can't talk about Israel as a settler colonial reality and not say, I live in a settler colonial reality and I'm a settler. And that means something, how does the settler and the native come to terms? And that's a subject for, a real discussion of what liberation and decolonization means. But that's entirely different than saying the whole lot of them are settlers and legitimate targets of the violence of the oppressed. Yeah. And, read Fanon and read it backwards and forwards. And you can read the experiences of colonized peoples and how they have struggled with dealing with this issue. And they dealt with it differently. I mean, the Algerians said it is legitimate to put bombs in cafes where civilians are sitting. And they did that. And 2 of the great heroes of the Algerian Revolution, I've met one of them, Zohar did that. And they would argue that Algeria wouldn't have been liberated, but for that and many other things, some of which we can label atrocities. There's certainly violations of international humanitarian law. The IRA carried out extraordinary bombings of civilians in Northern Ireland and in England, by the way. I mean, I can make an argument, one could make an argument that you would not have the Good Friday process, whereby some of the structures of oppression and anti-democratic rule of a tiny minority over what was once a majority and has become a minority in Northern Ireland has been dismantled. You can make an argument that there's another argument to be made, which is no, they didn't need to use violence. I personally don't think that's right, but You can make either argument. The point is,
Mhm.
you can say it would be better if you did not use this kind of violence and that kind of, and I would make that. I think it's morally indefensible. I think it's politically stupid, and it violates international law to target civilians. That's my
Mhm.
personal view.
Mhm.
And as a historian, I'll tell you that they do it again and again and again and again. It's going to happen whether we like it or not. It's a very hard thing to discriminate in that way, but I think you should.
Yeah.
But
Mm.
I don't think that you justify it by using they're all set. That's
Mhm.
that's unjustifiable and illegitimate. So that's an example, I think, of what you're asking.
If you're going to do it, don't justify it with that logic,
Yeah.
is
I
what you're
mean,
saying.
I don't think you should do it at all. But if you're going to
Right.
do, yeah, exactly.
No, thank you so much for responding in a way that guided us to this point, because you have more or less answered one of the bigger questions I had. And so I just want to invite you to kind of continue to land the framing that you offered, because, again, bringing in this historical lens, I think you are allowing us to have a more disciplined and mature conversation of where armed resistance has fit in the history of liberation movements. And what I wanted to know is, like, on what terms should we be at least learning or wrestling with that question right now? Because in my lifetime, armed resistance has been abstract or a thing of the past. And what I see right now is like three modes of discourse happening. The main one being like it not really occurring, people just like avoiding around it. Obviously, a like state centered, we could call it like terrorism projecting lens that the Zionist establishment and the United States are portraying. And then I see like kind of undisciplined lefty Twitter that has this like, romanticized notion of Lenin and of, raising arms and we're going to take over, that also doesn't seem to be disciplined or have rigor.
It
And
seems ahistoric
and
also.
ahistorical. And so I'm not forcing you into, I'm not asking you into a specific claim about where you stand to armed resistance. I'm asking you, as you were naming how we should not have the conversation, how should the discourse at least be set up? Because now that we have moved to past, a year of October 7th and have moved through some of the trauma of the immediacy, it does feel like an important conversations for movements to be wrestling
Right.
through in a way to learn.
Right. I mean, I'll answer as much of your question as I can.
Yes.
I think that, I'll start abstractly and then I'll get more specific.
I'm with you.
Occupation and oppression produces resistance. And that resistance takes a variety of forms, armed and violent.
Mm-hmm.
And here you have egregious cases of occupation, ethnic cleansing, and now genocide, producing all kinds of resistance, most of it actually violent. And if you look at other political spaces where this kind of equation has worked itself out, what you will see is that the people who take up violence, when faced with an alternative that, I'm not just saying that involves nonviolence, but that involves a resolution, have chosen eventually to stop violence. So you give the ANC, which is carrying out all kinds of revolutionary violence, the opportunity to dismantle apartheid, and they renounce violence. And they dismantle apartheid. They haven't solved anything, but they're halfway down the path towards maybe solving
They're
something.
doing something.
And at least they've dismantled apartheid.
Yeah.
You give the IRA, the provisional IRA, a chance to participate in governance and to dismantle the structures of supremacy of loyalist, unionist Protestants. And eventually they accept it. They decommission, they accept that, they have to go through a process and so on and so forth. And the FLN does the same thing in Algeria. They say, if you're going to give us independence, we'll stop fighting. And I think one of the points to be made here is that there is no alternative being offered. I mean, back in the 90s, I mistakenly believed that there was an opportunity for a Palestinian state. I thought that was an unsatisfactory outcome, but I was willing to try that and spend 3 years of my life negotiating, on and off. It wasn't all the time. We had 10 sessions over 3 years, each session a few weeks at a time, and preparing for. So a chunk of my life went to that, a big chunk of my life. And I was mistaken. That was never on offer. That was never an option. But when that possibility emerged, I was willing to say, well, maybe it's worth their renouncing violence, and maybe it's worth their abandoning what I think are the legitimate and more appropriate ends, which would have been a secular, democratic, future for both peoples in Palestine. And see if accepting partition will lead to sovereignty and independence and statehood, end of occupation, and then to settlement. It was never intended to do that by the Americans or the Israelis. It did not do that. Couldn't have done that. I was wrong. That's another issue. So I think a lot of this, there are people saying, what is it? Intifada forever. No, intifada until you achieve what you want to achieve. Not forever. You really want to live a life of total instability for the rest of your lives and your children's lives? No. Liberate.
Yeah.
You want to achieve some ideal end state, at which point you end it. And if there is that alternative, you end it. I mean, the Indian national movement was deeply divided over whether to use violent or nonviolent means. And we worship Gandhi because he was nonviolent. We forget that there were people at both ends of the political spectrum in India who were deeply committed to violent resistance to British rule. One of the characters I've worked on, a guy called Sir Charles Teagard, was the police commissioner.
That's a nefarious sounding name there.
He is nefarious son of a bitch, let me tell you. Dude becomes an expert torturer, interrogator, and they bring him from India to Ireland and set him up in the castle to help torture IRA guys and to help set up the interrogation facility. He eventually goes back to India. He becomes famous for establishing these torture centers in the Andaman Islands, where every Indian nationalist who was worth their name went through. And when the Great Revolt breaks out in Palestine in 1936, they bring him to Palestine. So dude has Irish experience and Indian experience. He sets up torture centers all across Palestine. Some of them are still in existence. They're called Teagard forts. So, I mean, when you're talking about India, you forget that this son of a gun was doing this stuff. And it wasn't like the Indians just lay down and took it and said, oh, we're nonviolent. They tried to kill him 6 times. Unfortunately, they missed. They tried to kill Teagard 6 times. That ain't no nonviolence. That's you kill your oppressor, And he used to take pride in having escaped. So he'd ride in an open car, and he made a big deal of it. So I wish they'd gotten it. But they did. So the point here is, even the Indian national movement was divided between people who favored violence. And the other folks were able to say, we're going to get India's independence this way, and they succeeded. But there was a huge part of the Indian army defected to the Japanese in World War II and fought against the British violently in World War II. Amitabh Ghosh has a book about it. His dad was one of those officers. It's called The Glass Palace. Brilliant. No, I don't know if I've answered the question.
No,
for sure.
You definitely you gave context. That's helpful. I have one more. You got something?
Yeah. We got time.
Okay,
we got time.
So I have one more question. I'm glad we've covered so much ground. Daniel mentioned, listening to the conversation with you and Bill. Bill helped set up this conversation. We're very grateful and have so much love for him and Bernadine. And y'all in many ways are like kindred spirits, just in kind of your presence. And I know y'all are comrades that, go way back. But there's another parallel in y'all's life that I want to talk about. And I'm going to broach the subject. I have curiosities. I'm going to allow you to set the terms of the conversation though. And that's, having proximity or connection to Barack Obama. And so before I get into my curiosity, are there any ways that you like to set the tables or the terms of the conversation around Obama?
Just ask away.
Okay.
You think I haven't dealt with this before?
I know you have. That's why I asked.
That's why we're asking.
Like to set the terms of the conversation. I'm sure you've dealt with it many times. So you've been trending on the Twitter spaces this past week for the same image that has come up for years. And it feels like you get used as a bogey for basically both sides of the political spectrum, I imagine. I'm sure at first it was to discredit Obama as a scary radical. He's sitting down with Rashid Khalidi. But recently, what has been trending is that and I'm wondering if this is going too far in the other direction, is that Obama, through sitting at this table with you and the presumed relationship that y'all once had, knows clearly the history of Palestinian oppression, settler colonialism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and the proximity to you to where he is now is a show of betrayal to liberation and justice for humanity. And so I feel deeply about how Obama has distorted the legacy of the Black liberatory tradition in the United States and the way that he chastises Black America at large. But when I'm curious for you, how it feels to be that bogey that gets used by each side, how much of that relationship feels accurately named, of like he does know, or where y'all just sitting at a table together.
Yeah, that's the thing, is sometimes you end up at dinner,
But
Like,
I know
when
y'all
you
were
end up
in
at dinner.
similar circles. And yeah, I mean, I think it's obvious that there's been a betrayal, but I would love for you to give context to if that's an accurate assessment, or if that assessment is too far or not going far enough as him. I think he is important beyond him, the human and the personality. Him as a state actor and a figure, and his legacy looms so greatly over all of us.
Yeah, it's as high as you can get.
Yeah.
I mean,
Even still,
that's actually higher.
Yeah. Three election cycles later, he's still kind of seen as America's president, even when he's not in the Oval.
Exactly. Okay, a couple things. People asked me after he was elected and they saw his behavior in office, did you feel disappointed? And I said, no. I had no expectations, and he has fully met that. So I think that this idea that because we knew him and we had dinner with him, and our daughters babysit the girls a couple of times, and we and Bill and Bernadine, organized fundraisers for him when he was running unsuccessfully against Bobby Rush in the 1st Congressional District. That means, and the fact that he was and is knowledgeable about this and many other things, means that he signed on to some, political manifesto and has betrayed it. No, that's wrong. He sat at a dinner table. He listened to the conversation. He clearly knew what we were talking about. Somebody asked him the other day, somebody I met just recently told me that she'd asked him the other day, have you read this book? And he says, I know. And I'm sure it's true. But
he didn't say he'd read it. For the record, that's a classic avoidance move. So it's like, oh, I've been reading this. Oh, yeah, no, I've heard of that book. Yeah, I heard it's great. I've pulled that move many times.
I would guess he's, but anyway, whether he's read it, he knows.
Yeah, no.
Am I disappointed? No. I mean, I always understood him. However well we knew him, we were neighbors. He was at the law school when I was teaching at the University of Chicago. He was our state senator. We had dinner together a number of times, mainly at our house, sometimes at Bill and Bernadine's, once at their place. And I came very quickly to realize this is an ambitious politician. And I'm a realist in the sense that I have what I think anyway is a very clear understanding of the American political system. I could go into Chicago politics and explain to you specifically what Lakeside liberals and the Chicago political machine and what it meant running against Bobby Rush in the 1st Congressional District, and what you therefore had to do to run a Senate race meant, and where he had to get his money from, who he had to get support from, who he had to overcome. But, those things, and he's going to have to go in a certain direction, or he's not going to be successful, and his ambition will be thwarted. And if you think of him as, because he's your friend and because he knows he's going to do this, that, and the other, well, then you're a little naive. I'm sorry. I've had dinner with a lot of people. They don't all agree with me. Yeah. That doesn't mean that changes what they do. So, my expectations, my low expectations were fully met. And I'm not disappointed, but I have to say that somebody of his heft and his weight could have helped to bring about a change on this issue that actually I don't think of any American politician who could have the same kind of impact. And so would it have changed things had he done that? Yes. Did I expect him to do it? No.
I think that's really wise and profound. And what I hear from how you explain that is that, again, it's not really about him. He's more or less like the personification of the liberal thrust, right? Of what
You know what you
American
realize?
liberalism has to offer.
You know what you realize when you studied power for a very, very long time? Some jackass prince puts the crown on and he changes. He becomes King Henry V. He's drunken lout. He's this carousing, whoring, good for nothing, treated like dirt by his father. And he puts the crown on, changes. Some lousy, disgusting, brutal soldier puts on the robes, he becomes emperor. And it changes it. Power changes you. The person that we had dinner with was fundamentally changed by becoming president of the greatest empire the world has ever known. I mean, that changes you. Whatever he was ambitious, intelligent, worldly, knowledgeable politician. But that's one level of being. You put on the robes and become emperor, and you become something. You're different. They deified their emperors, the Romans. The pharaohs were gods. We don't deify our presidents, but they're actually above the gods, if you want the truth. They had nuclear power, just like, the Roman guns. Thunderbolts? Well, there you go.
Right. No, and I think that's a good, extrapolation to understand an individual, but also to understand political thrusts. Right.
Power.
It changes you when you put the robes on.
Why do people like Weinstein, why do they think they can do anything?
Yeah.
Because they have power. They have wealth and power, and they think they're immune to human scrutiny.
It wouldn't be capable of doing it without it.
Think about political. Think about what you think is permitted to you as the most powerful individual on earth.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that's a good, I think, historical reminder, especially for people trying to build collective power and to be critical of what that means, and to, I think, understand the history of the space that we've been talking about for the last hour. What does it mean to assume those robes and have the power to destroy another people?
And in the inverse, what does it mean to then don the keffiyeh, or to participate in an encampment, or to show up to a vigil?
I'm so heartened by the people I see walking around New York City wearing keffiyehs.
Yeah.
I mean, this didn't happen before.
Yeah.
We may, I hope and pray, we may be near a tipping. You never know when it's going to come. I mean, that's the weird nature of politics. Nobody knew that they would overthrow the Egyptian regime the morning that they overthrew the Egyptian regime. This happens. When it happens, it happens. And I'm not suggesting I know it's going to happen soon, but we may be near a tipping point. I hope so.
Well, as we hope for that nearing tipping point, and we, want to be considerate of your time, just want to, obviously thank you for being in conversation with us, but more importantly, like I, alluded to, you have been such a gracious and diligent leader and guide and steward for so many people.
I can't even feed my grandchildren. Well,
leader of thought, of history, of processing, of the conversation for so long, much of it unseen, but you have touched so many people towards being, donning the right robes or being on this right side of history. And so we're just very grateful for your work. We're very grateful for humbly taking this time with us and all that you have done for the world as we continue to push our pebbles.
Thank you, Damon. Thank you, Damon. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Of course. All right, Pebble Pushers out. We're at AirGo Radio. I'm at AirGo Kiss. Let me re-ask this. Rashid, is there any... Rashid, how would you like you and your work to be found? What are the ways people can find you and the ways you want to be found?
I rigorously avoid social media.
Well done.
Much as I respect the social media for the enormous change that it's wrought. So, you got to go and buy the books and find the stuff online that I do. I mean, I do multiple interviews and talks a week on a bad week, 7. On a good week, only 1 or 2.
There you go.
It's all out there. You can find it.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, thank you. Hope it's a good week.
Read the books.
Absolutely. And we'll have the links to all that in the show notes and all that. Thank you again for spending this time with us. We'll be back reshaping culture for the more liberatory creative.
Much love to the people.
Pleasure.
Peace.
Take care, guys.